Hi everyone, I'm going to be talking about the problems with our primaries. So first, just a brief history about the primary system. So for a long time, the primary system didn't exist, and party elites would basically just get together and have a meeting, and they would pick who the presidential candidate for their party was going to be. And then in the early 1900s, the first primaries started to emerge, but they were basically just guidelines for the party elites, and they didn't actually have any power. Then in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention, there was a lot of controversy because the establishment candidate won, and a lot of people supported the anti-war candidate at the time. So then after that, the Democratic Party actually reformed its primary system, and they started using basically the system that we have today. And in the next election, the anti-war candidate won the Democratic nomination. And after that election, the Democratic Party kept the new system, and the Republican Party also adopted a similar one. All right, so there's 6 problems that we're going to talk about. Most of these are focused on the presidential primary system, but a few of them we will also talk about more local primaries. Okay, first I just have a little note, which is that parties, when they pick their candidate, they're trying to balance a bunch of different goals. So some of their goals are more strategic, but that's not really what we're going to be talking about. The goal that we're focused on today is that we want to select a candidate that actually reflects the will of the party members and has widespread support within the party. Okay, so first, the way this works for the presidential primary is that each state has a bunch of delegates, and then those delegates are sent to the convention, and at the national convention, they vote based on the outcome of the primary election in the state that they're from. So, to decide how many delegates each state gets, the parties use different formulas. So the Republican Party, each state automatically gets 10 delegates, and then they get 3 more per congressional district. And then they can also get some more delegates if the state is particularly loyal to the Republican Party. And then the Democratic Party also gives states a bunch of delegates based on the number of electoral votes. They also give some additional delegates if the state is loyal to the Democratic Party. And then they also give some additional delegates if the state has its primary later on. But unfortunately, this system is pretty confusing and leads to disproportionate results. So for example, Utah and Massachusetts both have 40 Republican delegates, but Utah has 960,000 registered Republicans, and Massachusetts only has 440,000. So as a result, the Massachusetts Republicans have more say in choosing the Republican candidate than the Utah Republicans do. All right, and here you can see 2 maps that show how many delegates each state gets in the particular party primary, and the darker colors are more delegates. All right, so now we're going to talk about proportional representation. So both parties are interested in having some kind of proportional system, and the Democratic Party actually requires proportional allocation of the delegates as long as a candidate receives more than 15% of the vote. But the Republican Party has a bunch of different systems with all different thresholds, and so that doesn't always lead to good results. The other problem with this whole idea of proportional representation is that primaries tend to have really low participation rates. So in 2016, the primary turnout was less than 30%, and in 2022, the primary turnout was around 20%. So what this means is that very few voters are choosing the presidential candidate. And then this is an even bigger problem in House elections. So House elections tend to be very uncompetitive between parties, which means that the primary is really critical. So as a result, these 20% of voters in a House district are really the ones who are deciding who is going to be the House representative for that district. So there's this whole problem where candidates are worried about getting primaried, which means that they're worried that these 20% of voters are not going to like them and they're going to lose their primary. And then obviously they don't get to be House representative again. But these 20% of voters often are likely to prefer like more extreme positions. And so this whole situation where candidates are worried about getting primaried can contribute to them taking more extreme positions. Okay. Another problem with the primaries is that some states use a winner-take-all system for their primaries. The Democratic Party actually requires proportional allocation of delegates for the presidential primary, but the Republican Party does not. And so a bunch of states use winner-take-all, which can elevate extreme or unpopular candidates. So that's something that we saw in the 2016 GOP primary, which is that Trump actually didn't have a majority of the votes in a lot of states, but he was able to win a majority of the delegates because we have this winner-take-all problem, which is the same as the first past the post that Winnie was talking about. So for non-presidential elections, things are arguably worse because pretty much everybody is using a plurality system. Okay, so here you can see the Republican Party, the map of how different states are assigning their delegates. And you can see that a lot of states are either using winner-take-all or a hybrid system, which includes some winner-take-all. Here's an example from the South Carolina Republican primary in 2016. So South Carolina assigns some of its delegates based on who wins in their different congressional districts. And then they also assign some delegates using a winner-take-all system based on the state election result. So they're trying to be proportional, but as you can see here, it didn't work out at all. So Donald Trump in 2016 won all of their delegates with less than 33% of the vote. All right, so next, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have these thresholds. So in the Democratic Party, in order for a candidate to win any delegates from a state at all, they have to get at least 15% of the vote. And then the Republican Party has a variety of different thresholds. But this is bad for less popular candidates or less well-known candidates who might be looking to build momentum throughout the primary elections. And that's because of these thresholds, people have to worry about wasting their votes. If they're voting for a not very well-known candidate, they think that candidate is probably not going to be able to get above the threshold, so they might not vote for them. Here's an example of that from the Louisiana Republican primary in 2016. So you can see John Kasich got 6% of the vote and Marco Rubio got 11% of the vote. But that's below the threshold for Louisiana, and so both of them received 0 delegates. Okay. The next problem with the presidential primary system is that at the national convention, candidates have to win a majority of the party's delegates. And if they can't do that, then we end up in a situation where there's a brokered convention. And basically what that means is that the delegates stop being bound by the election results of the state where they're from. And so then you end up in this very undemocratic situation where the delegates are just like making decisions based on their own opinion or what party elites are asking them to do. And then finally, the primary systems are very confusing and not very transparent. And ideally, since we're in a democracy, we want to use a system that voters feel like they understand and can trust. So how can we fix this? For the presidential primaries, we can institute a nationwide ranked choice primary for each party. That's relatively straightforward and it would resolve a lot of the problems. We don't have to worry about allocation or proportionality concerns. We also don't have to worry about the problems created by a winner-take-all system, and we definitely avoid a brokered convention. And And also, there's some evidence that ranked choice elections can lead to more people voting, which could potentially help resolve some of the participation concerns. And then for non-presidential elections, we should consider having just one nonpartisan open primary, and then we would take the top 4 candidates from that, and then in the general election, we would have those 4 candidates compete in a ranked choice election. Okay, so there's a few states that actually use a top 4 or top 2 primary system. You can see them here. Okay, so in the 2024 elections, a lot of states actually had ballot measures to switch to open primaries and also using ranked choice voting. You can see them there: Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and South Dakota. And you'll notice that these states sort of span different political ideologies. It's not like they're all Democratic states or all Republican states, but unfortunately these ballot measures did not do very well. And we're not totally sure if that's because these two reforms were bundled together. Maybe people were confused, but regardless, it seems like more education is really critical because as Professor Volich said, people are really unhappy with the democracy that we have in this country. And so this is a reform that could definitely help. And I think we just need to convince people that it can help in order for us to have support for it. All right, thank you.
That was a wonderful presentation, thank you. Do you think if we implement ranked choice voting that we even need primaries, and if so, what purpose do they serve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we have ranked choice voting, it's not quite as important that we have primaries. The main reason that we would want to still have primaries is just so that we are limiting that confusion issue with the ranked choice voting. So one of the problems with ranked choice voting is that occasionally you'll get an election where there's like 20 candidates, which is really confusing for people to learn about all those candidates and rank all those candidates. So if we use something like a top 4 or top 5 primary first, then there's a more manageable number of candidates.
Do you have any thoughts about like the difference between like open primaries versus closed primaries? Generally.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just for people who don't know, open primaries are when anybody can show up to the voting place on the day of the primary, and they can just say which primary ballot they want. Whereas a closed primary, you have to be registered as a party member in order to vote in that party's primary. I would say I haven't thought that much about this. Obviously, I think the nonpartisan open primary is the best, but I think the concern with the closed primaries is that there's a lot of people who aren't registered with either party, and they also probably tend to be our most moderate voters, and so it's sort of a problem that they aren't able to vote in the primaries in closed primary systems.
All right, thank you very much, Leah.